Hello everyone, this is Damon with Pixnub.com, and for this video I'm going to be discussing a small change I made for the hyperzoom actions in version 1.1, and also this gives me an opportunity to discuss in more detail the customization sub-actions. So the change I made was with some of the sub-actions that do the user customization, which you may not even use these, but even if you don't, I still recommend updating the action, and I'll show you why here in a minute. But some of these actions were off by default, and the default settings were meant for these to be off. So if you check these on, you are changing the default settings for how the action runs. And the reason I thought it was important to make this change is because it's too easy, especially with this red checkbox up here, but it's too easy for the user to see that because this red kind of draws attention. And if you click it and just click OK, then you've turned on every step in all the actions. So if the default steps were not using some of these sub-actions, by turning those on, it's changed the default settings. So I thought that was too easy of a mistake for users to make, and so I wanted to make that change. And going forward, all of my actions are going to be the same way, and that is with every action on by default. Now there still is the customization actions, but by default those are on, and to make the changes you'll uncheck the actions. Now the default settings are the exact same between the first version and this latest release. It's just the difference is the logic is reversed. So for example, there was an action on the old one called turn off color layers, and the action in the new one is turn on the color layers. So by default, with this on, the color layers are on. With the other one, with it off, the color layers were on. So it's just reversed, but in either case, the default is going to be the same when you run it. And by having it the way I have it now, if the user goes in and checks everything on, it's going to run default. Now you do see there's still this red checkbox, and that is because two of the sub-actions don't have all of the steps checked. And if not all the steps are checked, it'll be this red checkbox, and that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. It just means that it's not going to run all of the steps within that action. And what I did was I went in on these two sub-actions and put a copy of the default step on the very bottom. And that way, if the user was to check everything on, then that default step would be the last one that runs, and that's going to override the others. So I'm going to go through these now one at a time so I can better explain what the customization sub-actions are for. And these are really most useful for if you're batch processing, because, for example, the default builds a blue background. You might not want it blue. You might want it green or red or some other color. And there's an easy way to change that. And in the color switcher here, you could just uncheck the blue and then check one of the greens, for example. Now it's going to run with green whenever you run this. And any changes you make to these customization actions are going to affect all of the main actions when they run. So let's just go through all of these here. The one called use hue blend mode, what this is going to do, it's going to set the blend mode to hue, which is the default blend mode, and that's on because now the default setting is checked on in this action, but it sets that to hue. If you have this off, it's going to be in color blend mode. And if I switch to color here, you can see that it does give a different look than hue. And it just depends on the images which mode you like better. In all the testing I did, I liked hue better on a lot more of the images, so I use that as the default. But if you uncheck that, it's now going to use color whenever you run it. Okay, the next one, turn color blend layers on. And all that does is decides whether these color layers are on or off. So if this is off, when it runs, these color layers will be off. It's still going to build them, but it's just that they won't be checked on. And so you'll see the colors from your background image. So you see that this was our background image, it's blurred out, and we've got the colors from that. So the color switcher we just talked about, but this is how to change the default color that it runs. And even if your color layers are off, it's still going to change the color here, so you can just click to turn them on after it runs. The background brightness, this is that spotlight effect on the background, and this sets the strength of that. The default is 50. You can choose any one you want, so just uncheck the one you want. Let's turn it all the way up to 150, and then we'll run this, and so we can see all these effects take place when it runs. And also, as mentioned, the default is 50, so I did put this brightness of 50 copy of this step here at the bottom. That way the default step, if everything is checked on, it's going to revert back to the default. All right, I've made changes in every one. Oh, the last one is the user custom steps. There's nothing in here by default, but if you want to do anything more than what the action does at the end, if you want to add your own steps, you can record steps in here, and those steps will run at the very end of the action. So you can add your own custom steps to that. I'm not going to do that for this demonstration, but that is where you would do it, and that will run at the end of every one of the main actions. All right, so let's just run this here so we can see the changes that we made. All right, so the first thing here is the color layers were turned off because we unchecked that action here. If we turn these on, we can see that they are in color blend mode. That is because we turned off the hue blend mode sub-action. The brightness is set to 150. And remember, the default is 50 here, but we turn that up to 150 with this set background brightness step in the action. And that's it, pretty easy. So if you want to go back to default, you just check on these two actions. In the color switcher, the one on the bottom is the default. Although I've got the default in there twice, just because I put these in order of hue, and so in order to maintain the order, I left both of those in place. It really doesn't matter which one you check. If you check either the hue 210 or the hue 210 down here, they do the same thing. Then the background brightness, the one on the bottom is 50. So just know that this one on the bottom is 50. So if you want to get back to default, just remember that the bottom one here is the default. And there's also a 50 up here. You can check either one. Those are both default. I just left the one in here because, again, I put these in order 0 to 150. That way you still have them in order. I guess I'm kind of OCD that way. But in any case, now everything's back to the default. So let's just run this again. And you'll see that we're back to the default settings. And if you ever wanted to get lazy as well and not go into these and check the individual steps, you could just click everything on so that it's no longer red and you see the white checkbox, and it's still going to run default. It might take an extra 1 or 2 seconds to run because it has to do the redundant steps for the colors and the brightness, but it's really pretty quick. So, and this will be default as well. Anyways, I hope that makes sense and clears up any questions you might have about the customization steps in the actions, which, again, as mentioned, you really don't need to use these unless you're running batch, because it's very simple to go in and uncheck things or change blend modes as you want. So it's up to you whether you want to use these, but even if you don't use these, I still recommend updating. That way, just in case you accidentally check this on, you're not going to make it not default. It'll still be default when you check that on.